Let's turn a spatula. Starting with a blank. If you're in Wood 1 and watching this, these blanks can be provided for you. I'll cut them at the bandsaw to shape, and then you put them on the lathe to turn them. If you're in Wood 2, you'll be cutting your own blanks from wood, starting with the chop saw to length, and then the table saw to width, and then the bandsaw to get that overall shape so that it's narrow at one end for the handle and then wider at the other end for the paddle. Notice that for setup, we have what's going to become the paddle side in the chuck jaws held securely there, and then what's going to become the end of the handle is held by the live center, which spins with a workpiece. You really don't want to try to do this without that live center, because otherwise the end is going to get torqued and it's going to fly out of the holder. Also notice that this starts out quite square, and that means that we have to start by rounding over everything that we're going to be turning, which in this case is going to be the handle and then part of the transition from the handle to the paddle. And what that means is very light passes in order to not produce lots of tear out. Also repositioning the tool rest frequently in order to keep the end of the tool well supported right there, right next to the wood. Once the corners have all been knocked down and the handle is pretty well rounded over, you can start thinking about what shape you want it to have. If you want it to be perfectly cylindrical all the way down, if you want to have a narrow and wide parts. One thing to keep in mind is that you probably want to have an extra little piece down near the end where the live center is, so that you can get rid of the divot that's going to be created by that point. Stop occasionally to check the handle for tear out, splits, holes, gaps, as well as just general feel and shape. Put your hand on it and see if it is a pleasing shape to the hand as well as to the eye, and then you can go back to turning to adjust the shape and deal with any tear out and splinters that show up as a result of the turning. If you're going to turn down any part of the paddle at all, you need to be very careful not to get the chisel over all the way to the chuck and end up with metal on metal action. Keep in mind that the chisel is meant for wood application only. Also, keep in mind that we're going to take this over to the bandsaw to cut down the paddle. So turning down the paddle is kind of superfluous. Notice the pile of chisels I have laid out there. Couple of things going on there. One thing is to trade out chisels and just play with them and see how each one reacts and what you can do with it, what kind of curves you can get out of it. Another thing is, as each one starts to feel a little bit dull, you can trade out for a new sharp one. All of those have been sharpened recently, and they'll produce slightly different results, especially as they start to get dull. You want to keep things moving along by keeping a sharp chisel there. Once you have the handle at the shape that you want, it's time to start sanding, and this will be sanding just the handle. You're not going to sand the paddle on the lathe. And you're going to want to start at probably 100 or maybe 120 grit, and then move up from there, increasing the grit by no more than 50% of the current grit number. So if you're going to go from 120, you don't want to go more than 60 up to the next grit. So 120 to a maximum of 180 in your jump. So what I did there was I started at 120, and then I got 150, and then 180, and then 240, and then I topped out at 320 there. Notice in each of the numbers I listed there, the jump from one number to the next, the difference there, is less than 50% of the original number that I started with. So going from 180 to 240, that, when you subtract them, you get a value of 60. That is 1/3 of 180. Now, it's not that you can't make a bigger jump, All that means is that you're going to be spending a lot of extra time sanding off the scratch marks from the previous sandpaper because the new sandpaper is too fine a grit to deal with those scratch marks effectively. Once you have the handle finished, it's time to take it over to the bandsaw and draw out the basic shape of the paddle that you want and cut it out on the bandsaw. Keep in mind, once you do this, you're not putting it back on the lathe to adjust the handle at all anymore because it will not be balanced in the same way that it was. As always, just like with the scroll saw, make sure that you are not trying to cut curves with a wide blade and always cut on the waist side of the line. With the basic thickness and overall shape of the paddle cut off at the bandsaw, it's time to move over to sanding off all of those blade marks on both the face and the edges, knock down those sharp corners on the spindle sander. Notice that I didn't have the dust collector hose set up there and the dust is starting to land on the tabletop there. I highly recommend setting up the dust collector to suck up all that dust since you're going to be sanding this probably for quite a while and producing a lot of dust. Depending on the shape that you want, you might want to try the disc sander and see if that will be more effective or faster at taking off the excess wood so that you can get the final shape. However, keep in mind that the disc sander has a tendency to burn the wood. As you can see there, you're going to have to go back to the spindle sander to get rid of those burn marks. And the disc sander grit tends to get filled up with the dust as it burns onto there. So frequently you'll probably need to stop sanding and use a magic eraser to get rid of that dust that builds into the grit there so that you can go back to sanding. Back to the spindle sander to get rid of all those burn marks as well as finish up shaping. Notice that I've got the dust collector hose right there to suck away all of the dust, and that made this sanding experience way more pleasant. Once you've got the overall shape done, it's time to go with the orbital sander to get higher grit sanding pads so that you can smooth that out and get a very nice finish. Using the random orbital sanders for the end here is much preferable to continuing to use a spindle sander for a couple of reasons. One is that we don't want to take off more wood, we just want to smooth out what we've got, and we don't want to be changing the shape. The spindle sander is great for doing that. Also, changing the pads to get different grits on the random orbital sanders is a lot easier than changing the cylinders on the spindle sander. That's much more labor intensive and takes a lot more time. Once you have finished sanding to your preferred grit and shape and size, get all of that sanding dust out. Use mineral spirits, which then needs to evaporate entirely to get rid of it. And then you can put your finish on there, and we have mineral oil that is food safe, and you want to give that a thorough rubbing so that the oil thoroughly coats and soaks into all parts of the wood there. Once it has been thoroughly coated and the mineral oil has had a chance to soak in, you've got yourself a nice spatula that you can use for scrambling eggs, flipping pancakes, digging rice out of a rice cooker, or whatever else that you're going to use it for in the kitchen.